مرحبا بكم مجددا في الجلسة الثانية، وسيقدم سعادة مايكل كاردوفو عن زميلته صفاء الكوجلي من البنك الدولي ورقة حول الاستثمار في الطفولة المبكرة. ويقدم سعادة مانويل كاردوسو من منظمة اليونيسيف ورقة عن تقييم القرائية لتحسين التعليم. ويدير هذه الجلسة سعادة الدكتور رشيد الحمادي من وزارة التربية والتعليم، ونترك له تفاصيل السيرة الذاتية للمتحدثين، فليتفضلوا مشكورين.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدنا أن ندير هذه الجلسة بعنوانيها المهمين في الأمور التربوية. العنوان الأول الاستثمار في تعليم الطفولة المبكرة. ونحن في دولة الإمارات وضعنا أهداف استراتيجية وحسب الأجندة الوطنية أهداف استراتيجية تخص التعليم في الطفولة، التعليم المبكر والطفولة المبكرة. Allow me to speak in Arabic because I think some people were just a little bit sensitive about using our own language. المحاضرة الأولى بعنوان الاستثمار في الطفولة المبكرة، اللي المفروض كانت تقدمها الدكتورة صفاء الكوجلي. صفاء الكوجلي حالياً ما موجودة في الدولة، ولكن زميل لها اللي هو مايكل كروفورد اللي على يميني راح يقدم الورقة الخاصة بالاستثمار في تعليم الطفولة المبكرة. معلومات عامة عن الدكتورة صفاء كوجلي، مديرة التعليم لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا في البنك الدولي، وأخصائية أخصائي أول في البنك الدولي بخبرة تصل إلى 20 عام في الدراسات الخاصة بالطفولة المبكرة. قضت منها 15 عام في ضمن فريق البنك الدولي. شغلت الدكتورة الكوجلي أيضاً عدداً من المناصب في عدد من الدول العربية والبحر الكاريبي، شمال أفريقيا ومصر بالتحديد، فلها أبحاث عديدة ولها مؤلفات عديدة، أشهرها طبعاً كتاب بعنوان توسيع أفق الفرص للجيل القادم، تنمية الطفولة المبكرة في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. فيتفضل إن شاء الله الدكتور مايكل كروفورد. So we welcome Dr. Michael Crawford, who is here on behalf of Dr. Safa Kojali, and he's going to present her talk. So تفضل, please. Join me in welcoming him, please.
Your Excellency, Minister Hamadi, Royal Highness, Excellencies and Highnesses, honored guests and participants, it's a privilege to be here on behalf of the World Bank, and Dr. Safa sends her sincere apologies and warm greetings to this conference. She wishes she could be here, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue in another opportunity. I will be presenting on her behalf, and the purpose of this talk is to look at early childhood development. The talk looks somewhat from a regional perspective, and in the question period we can talk more about the national perspective. But the presentation would like to look at what is ECD, why we invest in ECD, how the coverage is evolving in ECD in the region. The important thing about this presentation is to understand two main facts. First, that while coverage is increasing, it is low. And second, early childhood development is the most important time to start students on the path to readiness to learn and avoid the potential inequalities that come from the deprivation or from negative experiences early on. So what is early childhood development? It looks at the development of the whole child, the physical, emotional, and cognitive development, that gets a child ready for school. There are different, there are different definitions, but generally, early childhood development and early childhood education focus on the prenatal, postnatal phase, the 0 to 3 years of age phase, and the 3 to 6 year phase, where students in many parts of the world are entering into formal programs in centers. When children are entering into center-based care, a great deal of attention is paid to the types of services and the quality of services that they receive. And throughout this period, ECD is perhaps the most multidimensional time of education, again, where the physical, socio-emotional, and cognitive aspects of development are trying to be brought together in a harmonious way. What I would emphasize from this slide is that there are critical periods in a child's development as the brain is maturing for different types of skills and capacity. Language and the sensory skills and language are developed very early, of course, and then you see the rest of the school career is meant to have adequate development for the long-term acquisition of higher cognitive function. So on this graph, we start with conception and the first 12 months, but it also goes out to the full 17, 18 years of basic education. And if the foundations are not put in place in that first year, the first 1,000 days, obviously children are at a disadvantage throughout the rest of the school career. So the aspects of ECD to be integrated are health and survival. In many World Bank partner countries, child survival is still a very serious question, and deprivation, severe deprivation in the early years, which has devastating effects. Inclusion and school readiness are the three factors that we hope will work together. There is a very large body of literature that shows that the cost effectiveness and the benefits from ECD are higher than any other investments in schooling. What you can do with resources spent well in the first years of a child's life bring returns that outweigh what happens later in the career, especially because it's much more expensive to invest later on. It's expensive to correct or to get a child back on a path when they've gone off a path. So putting the resources into the early years brings particularly high returns. And what are those returns? Of course, better educational performance. There's a lot of evidence that when children get off to a good start, even when measured decades later, they do better in their careers and earnings. They have overall better health and avoidance of certain social pathologies like crime. The full pathways by which this happens are not completely understood, but the statistical relationship between this good foundation and a lifelong ability to act better and to act in self-interest is well established in the literature. So what is the status of early child development in the Middle East and North Africa region? That's the term we use in the World Bank for this region. Well, the fact is that the region has been somewhat slow as a whole to embrace investment in ECD. If we look at East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central America, and Latin America and the Caribbean, about 3 out of 4 children now are enrolled in pre-primary programs, and this is center-based care. It has really become common, the norm in those regions. In the world, it's about 1 out of 2, and in the region, it's slightly less than 1 out of 3. It's not the lowest region in terms of enrollment, but it's among the lower regions. And when we look at this, break this out by countries, and we can talk in the question period, of course, the United Arab Emirates here leading the region in terms of coverage among the countries that are closer to the highest enrolled countries. But then we look across the region and we see very, very disparate levels of coverage that are worrying from the point of view of getting all children off to a good start. We also know that while some countries have overcome the challenges of early health and nutrition, others are still struggling with those. 1 out of 5 children in the region is stunted, and millions are at risk because of this failure to develop physically in the early years, and even some basic micronutrient issues like access to iodized salt are still issues that some countries are dealing with. And so, again, the World Bank, from our perspective, region-wide perspective, there's a big agenda here for eliminating these disparities. Again, you can see how the great differences across countries in the number of children who fail to reach their growth potential. So, how does ECD then affect the ability of children to move through school together? Excuse me. Well, I think we're missing something on this slide. There's supposed to be additional graphics here, but access to ECD really brings together some critical factors in a child's basic characteristics, which determine whether or not they're going to get an equal start. The parental education is a very important access, both in coverage and in the terms of the quality of readiness to learn. And ECD programs are meant especially to focus on households where parental education may be low and make up for those deficits. Also, the socioeconomic status of the child is another factor that really varies, and where ECD is meant to equalize opportunities and bring everyone to the same level. And of course, as we've seen, where the country or the region that you're born into. So what's the probability? Unfortunately, these equalizing factors can't take place if children aren't enrolled. So if you're among the least advantaged, who are in the greatest need of ECD, they're the least likely to get. And those who have the advantages already from the household are most likely to be enrolled. You can see in some cases almost 100% chance of enrollment among the advantaged children, and less than a 15% chance among the disadvantaged. Again, great variation by country. So another issue we're concerned with the World Bank is documenting the positive effects of ECD, which has been done in many regions of the world with greater and greater amounts of data, but perhaps not as much in this region as it could be. So there have been 80 impact evaluations that have been brought together in a meta-analysis globally, and only 3 of those pertain to this region. So there's really great room to further study how ECD is working here. So as we think about new investments, I think there are two important questions that come to the fore. What does it mean to have a high-quality ECD program at the regional level and especially at the national level? What do you wish to achieve in the early years of education? And how can this be an opportunity to really equalize readiness to learn instead of what we're seeing, that polarizing effect? Unequal initial conditions, unequal access to ECD is taking children in the opposite direction of readiness, and these programs are meant to bring them together. So I think that so again, we've seen, this is more on the polarization about those who are, in effect, most in need of ECD are least likely to get it. And the World Bank is putting together a regional initiative that we hope will be able to address some of these deficiencies. So as part of the regional initiative, greater attention is needed to the quality of programs, approaches to support the most disadvantaged children, and the World Bank is putting together an ECD evaluation incubator to know more about how ECD is functioning. The objective would be to look at new approaches, innovative approaches, especially for the most disadvantaged, and to offer services to governments that are trying to move forward. So those services would be capacity building on impact evaluation and measurement, development of partnerships and getting some of the leading countries to transfer lessons to some of the emerging countries, making tools, analytical tools available. Again, we've seen that other regions are well ahead in analyzing what's working, and to make funding opportunities available. So I'm going to stop here, and again, on behalf of Dr. Safa, thank you very much for the chance to participate today.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. I will, please have a seat. I would start with maybe a generalized question. When we speak of ECD, early childhood development, where does education come? We say development. Are we talking about physical development, mental development, or educational development? So can you comment on that question, please?
So that's an excellent question, and I think it's very important to understand we use two terms, ECD for early childhood development and ECE for early childhood education. And it is very important to emphasize the special character of the early years that is not just starting schooling earlier. The readiness to learn is a lot about socialization, play, good, strong physical development, and the elements of learning, but it is not, it doesn't succeed if you're simply trying to start school earlier. By nature, children learn through creativity, play, peer interactions, and the whole socio-emotional agenda gets them ready. The readiness to learn is to be better students when the time comes to devote themselves to more academic studies. So if you lose the character of the childhood nature of ECE, you really are going to be not getting the benefits, and you have to respect that this is a different time of life for children.
Thank you. I have another inquiry, I guess, regarding the 9-month peak on the graphs that you showed probably in the third slide for language competency. In United Arab Emirates, our Ministry of Education is actually setting an example, a leading example, in fact, in the early childhood education, as early as 4 months, even from birth to all the way to 4 years or 5 years, just pre-kindergarten age. Who do you think from our professionals are needed in order to execute a very well-planned early childhood education material and early childhood development material? Do we need people from educational background only, exclusively? Or do we need people as developmental psychologists, for example? Or do we need people from the medical background, or all together? Can you give us some kind of an insight on that,
yes.
please?
Thank you. So I would just share a piece of research about language acquisition, which I think is very telling for the 0 to 3 age. When children are exposed to a native speaker of a language, a foreign language, perhaps you might have a caregiver who speaks a different language from the maternal language. Later in life, even if they have not become fluent in that language, they have better capacity to hear the different sounds. And here's the interesting part. only if it's a live human being speaking to them. So if you might have a Chinese nanny taking care of your child, 20 years later you go to learn Chinese, you retain the ability to distinguish sounds. This doesn't work when you play Chinese, recorded Chinese to a child. It's a holistic, again, it's this holistic nature of the child interacting with a person, facial expressions, touch. And the reason I bring that up is that what you're doing is preparing the child for the later acquisition of sophisticated skills. So there's research on how hearing grammatically well-spoken, sophisticated language, which happens in higher SES households, prepares a child to learn a deeper learning of their native language later. So that's the long answer. The short answer is well-prepared home programs and early stimulation are the core of the 0 to 3. Having parents who read on a daily basis, 10 minutes. In the United States, the American Academy of Pediatricians adopted 10 minutes of reading of every parent as a health indicator for all children. So it's about bringing together that expertise in a simple home-based program that prepares for the later acquisition of a sophisticated skill.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. I will open the floor for 3 questions, and Your Excellency, please. Microphone. Microphone يا إنك.
Here comes the microphone.
Thank you, Doctor, for this presentation. The term that you used, ECE, whereas we in the, for example, UNESCO and UNICEF, we use the term ECCE. So the other C, that's the care, is missing from your presentation. Where do you see it fits? Because development and education without the previous C, that is the care, it might be not completed. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I think that there are some differences in the terminology, but I believe the substance is what some would call ECCE, we might call ECD, which is development, the holistic development of the child in the early years. ECE has come to signify some special preparation for school readiness that might have to do with letter recognition or the rudiments of reading, but it's a subset of the overall early childhood development. And as I said, you certainly don't want to lose that character of care and play and childhood, the special character of childhood in these programs. And I think perhaps the term you mentioned might capture that better.
أي استفسار آخر من الجمهور؟ Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Crawford. We appreciate your Q&A session and your presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Manuel Cardoso. I will speak Latin. I will present that in Arabic again. Dr. Manuel Cardoso يعمل اختصاصيا في التربية في المقر الرئيسي لمنظمة اليونيسيف في نيويورك منذ 2014، وهو المنسق الدولي في مجال التعليم. يقود حاليا تطوير نموذج مهارات التعليم الأساسية الميكس مالتيبل انديكيتور كلاسترز، هو اللي يقود المسح العنقودي البرنامج هذا، متعاونا في ذلك مع المكاتب الوطنية والإقليمية للمشاريع المتعلقة بالتعليم وتقييم التعليم. يمثل أيضا الدكتور كاردوسو اليونيسيف في اللجنة التوجيهية لمشروع قياسات التعليم LMTF، وأيضا المجموعة الاستشارية للاختبارات الدولية بيزا. راح يقدم لنا ورقة بعنوان تقييم القرائية لتحسين التعليم. So we welcome Dr. Manuel Cardoso to present his paper about literacy evaluation to improve education. So please join me in welcoming him.
Shukran. I need to apologize. First of all, I'm going to speak in English, not in Arabic. Trust me, you would rather hear me speak English than Arabic. I will be addressing the issue of how to assess literacy to improve learning. And I would like to clarify a couple of things. One, I am not officially representing UNICEF, even though I work there, because I'm going to address part of my work at my previous job, which was at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics in Montreal. So this is not just, although I will mention some of my work at UNICEF as well. And the second thing that I would like to say is that I'm actually not going to talk about results of international assessments like PISA and TIMSS. I'm going to talk about what happens before we get to those results and how to address some of the issues that come when we are learning and teaching literacy. And one very important thing is that we cannot extrapolate the frameworks that are applied to teach and test one language into a different language. So, like I said, I'm not able to speak Arabic to you, to present this in Arabic, which doesn't mean I'm not aware of the fact that Arabic is a different language from some of the languages in which most of the research in reading has been conducted. So that is going to be a central point in my presentation, how the specificities of Arabic require that we think about Arabic in itself when we talk about learning, teaching, and testing Arabic. So the plan for this presentation focuses on 3 questions. The first one is what to assess when it comes to reading and writing. Even though we will talk a lot more about reading than writing, there's a lot more research and a lot more international assessment when it comes to reading than writing. And we will talk about different stages in reading development, learning to read and reading to learn. We will talk about issues of inequity in learning to read and issues of sustainability. How to assess reading and writing in Arabic? Well, we will see that Arabic is, of course, a language with its own specificities. It's also a script with its own specificities, and it's an orthography. We will define what orthography means, but basically it means that a language is written down by using a script in a specific way, and we will also address that. And finally, how can a country improve the overall performance of its education system by improving literacy? What impact should this have on overall performance, and how is that reflected in the international assessments in which a country participates? So those, first of all, we should think about the 2 stages in reading development. There are basically 2 stages. The first one we call normally learning to read. That goes roughly between pre-kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. That is what we normally consider learning to read. And then children need to pivot to reading to learn. So there's a stage in which they develop what we call the building blocks of reading. And then they use the reading competency that they've developed to learn new things, to go beyond what they already know. When it comes to what to assess in each stage, in the first stage, in the learning to read stage, we should focus on what we call already the building blocks, oral language comprehension, precursor skills like letter naming, word recognition, and so on. Accuracy, meaning reading words correctly, and fluency, meaning reading words fast enough so that we can retain enough information in the brain to be able to understand what we're reading. This sounds simple enough, but it's really not. First of all, oral language comprehension is not easy to test, and it's extremely important. We cannot learn to read and write a language that we cannot speak and understand. So that is something that we tend to forget, and it's extremely important. And precursor skills are specific to different languages. Reading, recognizing letters or recognizing words in one language is a different process from doing the same in a different language. So that is something that we need to take into account, and the same applies to fluency. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. As we transition from learning to read to reading to learn, we need to transition into reading comprehension. We need to emphasize more and more the ability to understand what we read. And that comes also with a focus on everything that surrounds skills. So it's not just about skills. It's also about habits, about self-perceptions, about the literate environment. Do we live in an environment that fosters reading or that doesn't really place enough value on it? So we need to ask the right questions when it comes to literacy. The simple question, can we read, can be decomposed into or disaggregated into learning to read and reading to learn. And when we talk about learning to read, we mean, do we speak the language in which we are learning to read? So we have oral language competence. Are we able to name letters? Are we able to recognize words? Are we able to read connected text accurately? Connected text means, for instance, a story. Are we able to read it fluently? And are we able to understand what we read? All of that is part of the learning to read stage. Although emerging reading comprehension is an emerging skill towards the end of that stage. And then reading to learn requires that we go beyond that we are able to draw conclusions from what we read, not just locate information, but draw inferences, inferential comprehension. And also that we think critically about what we read. So reading is a foundational skill, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a higher order skill. It can also be a higher order skill. It depends on how far we take it, and we should take it as far as we can, eventually. So this distinction between learning to read and reading to learn is very important, because if children don't learn to read, they will not read to learn. And what typically happens is that in a classroom or in an education system, some children, as Dr. Crawford said, because of inequities that come from the household and sometimes are even sometimes they are even made worse by the fact that some children participate in early childhood education and some don't. So children come with different backgrounds into early grades, and some of them develop the foundational skills and some don't. And what this produces is what's called Matthew effects, meaning that those who start with an advantage become more and more advantaged, and those who start with a disadvantage become stagnant. They don't learn what they need to learn to continue to advance academically. So this is a very important concept, which means that we need to emphasize the fact that every child needs to have the foundational skills before we can move on to reading to learn. So, so we have the learning to read, the reading to learn, and then how do we guarantee that children continue to read? Is it enough to give them the skills? No, it's not enough to give them the skills. We need to encourage them to develop habits and to develop a healthy self-perception of themselves as readers. And we need to create an environment that encourages them to read. So all of that can be done through the school, but also through the household. So this is a little bit of a footnote, but it's important to say that when we talk then about skills, we shouldn't talk only about academic skills. There are life skills, there are social, emotional skills that will also be important in this process. There's a couple of processes that are happening at UNICEF. I'm making reference to those there, and you can follow those links. One of them looks at an early grade reading assessment in Tanzania that doesn't look just at skills, but at reading skills, but also at academic grit, the ability to persevere academically, and self-regulation, the ability to control our own behavior, that are found to correlate with reading skills. And the other example is a broader take on life skills and citizenship education that is happening in this region, in the MENA region, and if you are interested, you can follow that link. So, when we put all of these things together, when we emphasize first learning to read and then reading to learn, we create habits and attitudes and feelings of self-efficacy in an adequate literate environment, we can not guarantee, but we can expect to have skills that are equitable so that everybody has access to them and that they are sustainable. So, but we need to bring all of these elements together, which of course is not easy. Why is it important in this context to assess literacy? Well, there are many reasons, and these are, of course, not all the reasons, but just as a few examples. Assessing literacy is important at the classroom level. Why? Because it has a formative purpose, meaning to improve learning through feedback for learners and teachers. So that is what we normally call formative assessment or assessment for learning. There are different labels. They're slightly different from each other, but the important thing is the purpose is to produce feedback and to continue to learn. The second purpose is to certify achievement of benchmarks for promotion or accreditation. This is what we normally call examinations, or sometimes we call this high-stakes tests. We often don't pay enough attention to these tests. These are very important, particularly if sometimes classroom assessment can be very, very progressive, very innovative, very modern, but we have examinations that are very old-fashioned, and that maybe for the students is what matters, because that is what will allow them to continue. So we need to take that sort of thing into account, that to make the assessment system consistent, the different parts of it consistent with each other. A third purpose of assessment is to provide a snapshot of literacy performance and equity across classrooms and school over the entire system. This is what we normally call system-level assessments. And in some cases, this may include children who are not in school. A further purpose, well, this is what we normally call national assessments, but not the examination types, but the low-stake types. Then we have international assessments that have the purpose of comparing education systems and fostering competition and cooperation among them. And this includes international large-scale assessments such as PISA and TIMSS and so on. And also related to this, we can add a new purpose or a new objective here, which is to monitor countries' progress towards global commitments. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, did not include a learning objective, but the current SDGs do include a learning objective, which is 4.1.1, which calls for minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics in grades 2 and 3, end of primary and end of lower secondary. So those are some of the reasons why it is worth assessing literacy. Let me talk a little bit about cross-national reading assessments and describe them briefly before we go into how Arabic poses a different set of challenges. There are different kinds of cross-national reading assessments. The best known ones are school-based and cross-regionals, such as PEARLS, which is a reading assessment that takes place in 4th grade, and PISA, which is a reading, mathematics, and science assessment that is administered to 15-year-olds. In some regions, although interestingly not this region, have regional assessments. Latin America has the Liese, Sub-Saharan Africa has PASEC in the French-speaking countries and SACMEC in the English-speaking countries. The Pacific Islands have PILNA, and Southeast Asia has CPLM. And what is interesting about these cross-regional assessments is that they've managed to make education part of the public debate. PISA, for instance, has made education part of the conversation in many of the countries that participate in it. Then there are other types of assessments that focus on early grade, like EGRA or Literacy Boost. And those assessments are also present in some of the countries in this region. Finally, we have household-based assessments, like the citizen-led assessments, that are not conducted by the government, but by networks of citizens, like the PAL network, ASER in India and Pakistan, and in different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ueso, Jangandu, Bekungo, etc. And UNICEF does mix the multiple indicator cluster survey, which is not an assessment, it's a household survey, but it includes an assessment module that looks at reading and mathematics. So what is the issue with cross-national reading assessments? The issue is that they may or may not take into account the specificities of each language, of each script, of each culture that participates in the assessment. That is one of the reasons why there are regional assessments, because they find that they have more things in common than countries that are in a different region, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case in this region. There is no regional assessment in MENA. And it's a good question. I don't know why that is. But what I would like to address now is why there are specificities in how Arabic should be taught and learned and tested. Arabic is, of course, first of all, an oral language, right? And then it's also a script. And then, but a script, for instance, the Arabic script is not only used to write Arabic, it's also used to write Farsi and Urdu and a number of other languages around the world, but each of those languages uses the Arabic script differently from the way in which the Arabic language itself uses that script. So we have a language, we have a script, and we have an orthography that connects the Arabic language with the Arabic script. Is the specific way in which the Arabic language uses the Arabic script, if we can put it that way. Each of those three elements poses challenges, or not necessarily challenges, but should be taken into account when reading and writing in Arabic and when teaching and learning and testing in Arabic. For instance, the Arabic language is a clear example of what's called diglossia. Diglossia is basically a technical term that means two languages. When Ferguson in 1959 created the term diglossia, Arabic was one of the examples that he had in mind. What does this mean? That in any given Arab society, there are at least two languages that are being spoken. Colloquial Arabic, the language that's spoken every day, and modern standard Arabic, the language that is used in formal situations and is used for reading and writing, typically. Another important characteristic of language, of Arabic as a language, is its morphology. Its morphology is based on roots and word patterns. This is, I'm talking particularly about the modern standard Arabic. And what happens here is that this makes words in Arabic very regular, very easy to predict. And that also has important consequences when we learn or teach Arabic. Then the script has also its own specificities. For instance, letters look differently if they're in isolation or in a word. We're going to talk about that in a second. And finally, the orthography has its own specificities too, with the issue of vowelization. Whether we use short vowels or not, the diacritics that represent short vowels when we write the language down. So I'm going to address each of these four issues quickly. When we talk about diglossia, why is diglossia an issue? We assume that the better we speak and understand a language, the better we can learn to read it and write it. The problem is that the assumption that's behind that is that we are speaking and reading the same language. And that is not the case when there is diglossia. One language variety is spoken, the colloquial Arabic, and another one is written and read, modern standard Arabic. And how does this affect reading assessment, and how does it affect reading development? Let me give you an example that's based on my own work on this in a program called Literacy Assessment and Monitoring Program, LAMP, that we piloted in Morocco, Jordan, and Palestine, among other countries. When we went to Morocco, we were measuring vocabulary, oral vocabulary, to see if people had the language skills that they needed to learn to read. So we showed them this picture of a bike, and we expected them to say that that was called daraja, the formal, the modern standard Arabic word for bike. But they said all sorts of different things. They hardly ever said that word. They said begala, bicicleta, all sorts of other words that were related to Berber, to French, to Spanish, to a number of other influences that Moroccan Arabic has. So that is part of what I mean when we talk about diglossia, right? So we went with this framework that was developed by John Sabatini from Educational Testing Services, very, very well known and very well respected academics, but they were thinking about this whole thing in terms of English, how English works. So when we were piloting this, I realized this is not going to work, because when people see a picture of a bike, they don't think about literature. They think about the bike in everyday life. And in everyday life, they don't use the word daraja. So they're never going to say the word daraja. We need to change the approach to this. And we did. Instead of using the picture and ask them what that was, we would give them options. And they said, is this a daraja or is this a sayara or whatever? And they would answer the question, it's this or that. That way, we gave them the framework of the modern standard Arabic, and they were able to give us the right answer that way. But this is important, even more important for reading development. What's going to happen when a child comes to school without knowing modern standard Arabic, knowing only colloquial Arabic? Well, that makes that child a candidate for those children who will be left behind. So that is something that we need to think about, not only in terms of assessment, but also in terms of reading development. The next point has to do with roots and word patterns. And this is something that could be a huge advantage for a language like Arabic. When I was in Jordan, and our colleagues from Palestine came to train the Jordanian colleagues on how to apply this survey, I was listening to the conversation, but I don't really speak Arabic, so I could only understand a few words here and there. But what was interesting to me is that at one point, they were talking about household surveys, about selecting the household, selecting the house, and so on. And at one point, they said the word maskan. Maskan. And I didn't really know the word. I had never heard the word before, and I probably pronounced it incorrectly right now. But I knew the verb sakana. I knew which means to live somewhere, right? To reside, to inhabit a place. And I knew the word maktab and other words that mean, well, the place where you do something. So I was able to understand that they were talking about a dwelling, the place where someone lives, based on my basic understanding of roots and word patterns in Arabic. That is a huge advantage that should be exploited when reading development is approached in Arabic. Turns out that the old Arab grammarians were right. Recent neuroscientific evidence shows that that is exactly how the Arabic-speaking brain is wired in terms of roots and word patterns. Doesn't mean that it needs to be taught the way the old grammar was taught. There are more interactive ways of teaching it, but that is an important aspect that doesn't exist in English. In English, if you think of, for instance, in Arabic, if you think of kataba and a number of the words that are associated with it, it's transparent. If you think of maktab, katib, kitab, and so on, in English, the words don't look alike. You cannot recognize write, book, library, office, just by looking at them. They don't look alike. It's not transparent, the relationships between them, because they come from different languages. They are loan words or they come from different languages. Moving on to the script, the changing letter forms, and I'm going to go fast because I'm running out of time. The changing letter forms are also something that we cannot just transpose what we know about English and apply it into Arabic. The relationship between recognizing letters and recognizing words is not the same in Arabic as it is in English. I'm not going to go into much detail on this. And finally, vowelization. Vowelization is a big challenge also because we know that in Arabic there's a different approach to reading, which means that we don't necessarily go from the bottom up. Basically, the issue with vowelization is that diacritics are sometimes not used when we write short vowels, or when we don't write them, actually. Therefore, that makes it difficult to understand what a word is, particularly when it's presented in isolation. I'm not going to talk about this long either. You know it better than I do. But the important thing for Arabic is that we have two ways to approach reading, the learning and the teaching of reading. One is bottom-up. And in that approach, we think of letters that form words, words that form sentences, and so on, right? That approach doesn't necessarily work in Arabic. The other approach is a top-down approach where we start with background knowledge and we go from that level to comprehension. There's a model called interactive compensatory model or theory that says that only less proficient readers need to rely on context in order to compensate for the less efficient decoding skills. This was developed in the 70s by a Canadian who was basically thinking of English, right? But more recently, other researchers have looked at this and they say that highly proficient readers of Arabic seem to benefit more from contextual information than less proficient readers. What does this mean? the Canadian scholar was saying, those who cannot read rely on context. But in Arabic, what we're seeing is that you rely on context to become a better reader. So it's a different approach. It's a completely different approach. So highly proficient readers are highly proficient because they rely on context when it comes to Arabic. So, some options to consider for teaching and testing reading in Arabic. First of all, comprehension is the goal of reading. It should be part of instruction and assessment. We need to teach comprehension strategies. That, of course, is part of reading to learn. It comes after 4th grade once everybody has learned to read, basically. But we need to take it further. Fluency is needed for comprehension, but it's not the purpose. It's a means to an end. We should not make fluency the be-all and end-all, which sometimes happens. Collecting information about reading habits, attitudes, and self-perceptions makes skills, well, not collecting information, but it's important to collect information to make sure that we are developing the habits and the attitudes and the right self-perceptions and creating the right environments. Another important thing is to take a gender perspective. When it comes to reading, you all know how in STEM fields, girls face a disadvantage. Girls and women face a disadvantage. What's interesting is that in reading, it's often the opposite, right? And once women start going into the system, the education system, girls tend to thrive in school. And there's literature on that. Duckworth's paper called Self-Discipline Gives Girls the Edge is something that I would recommend. But girls excel academically, particularly in literacy, and sometimes in some regions, like this region, boys get left behind, particularly when it comes to reading. So we also need to ask ourselves the question, how can we get boys interested in reading? And one solution that some have explored is gamification, using different games to teach reading. And this is a controversial set of suggestions, and that is why all of them have question marks. And it's just to put these things out there so that you, the experts, can really think these through. What can we do to improve learning of reading in early grades? Well, one option could be to teach and test modern standard Arabic or Arabic oral skills. Not just make the assumption that every child that goes into school already speaks modern standard Arabic, which is the language in which they will learn to read and write. Another way is to encourage parents to read to their children in modern standard Arabic at home. This has the problem that not all parents are going to be equally capable of doing that. And this, I am aware that this is a very controversial suggestion, but I'm only just mentioning as one possibility of many options that can be explored, is to teach and test reading and writing skills in colloquial Arabic. Not in itself, but to make the transition, to make the transference later to standard Arabic. I'm not the expert, so I'm not going to advocate for any one of these options. I'm just saying that these options have been mentioned by Arab scholars as possibilities that can be explored. And finally, improving literacy can improve a country's learning, and international assessments can show it, and this can happen in a number of ways. First of all, some international assessments like PEARLS focus specifically on reading, and others like focus on math and science, but we know that reading mediates math and science performance. But an important thing to take into account is international assessments are only one source of information about the state of the education system, so we shouldn't take them as the only source of information that we should use. In a very quick recap, some simple ideas to close. Everybody must learn to read before they can read to learn. So we need to focus on foundational learning skills. But then we must read to learn. We must learn to read to learn. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but what I mean there is that comprehension strategies need to be taught. Their children are not going to just infer this. Literacy skills, we use them or we lose them, which means that we need to encourage practice. Children need to learn to enjoy to read. We need to teach and test Arabic literacy on its own terms, which means finding a way, or a number of ways, a number of strategies to do this. And one way could be consider diglossia as a form of bilingualism, right? And bilingualism can provide huge cognitive advantages. So we don't want students to forget either of these languages, colloquial Arabic or modern standard Arabic. They should both be present in their lives. That would give them advantages. In areas like the Gulf, there are 3 languages. English is very important too, so triglossia is a reality in this region. The vocabulary of modern standard Arabic is predictable and therefore it's productive. Means if we know the roots, if we know the word patterns, we can combine them and we can understand a lot of new words that we've never heard before. Literacy mediates all academic learning, and international assessments are not an end in itself, but a means to an end. The end is the development of the education system, and that is why they are important for this purpose. Some references, and a big thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cardoso. Please, it's a very interesting idea that we devoted an entire lecture for the Arabic language, so that everybody is happy in the audience. I think I have so many questions because, but I will just maybe limit them to 1 or 2 questions. Thinking about building a corpus of concepts in education, how do you see that idea fit into the developing a literacy program? I think the question stemmed from having a clear corpus for the English language and for other languages. So can you kindly comment on this issue, please? Thank you.
There is a growing body of literature on this, and it's a lot of it done by Arab scholars. For instance, in the United Arab Emirates, Sami Boudala, for instance, is writing on this right here, and he looks at neuroscientific evidence on how word recognition in Arabic works. And this is done in other countries in the region as well by Arab scholars. So I think this is an example of what I would call basic research in the Arabic language, not so much applied research. So I think what needs to be done is to take that research, that basic research, and to find ways to learn from that how to teach the language and how to learn the language and how to test it, because this is done mostly in labs, basically neuroscientific labs that look at processes in the brain and so on. But that has clear implications, or at least clues as to how to teach and how to test the language. And I think so more work needs to be done. This is, I can share some references of the literature available in English, but there's a growing body of literature in English and some of it in Arabic as well, by Arab scholars.
Thank you. And I think you also made a very interesting comment about having the individuality of each language on its own right. A lot of countries, they use, for example, a common European framework for language, for a common European framework to probably approximate their own language literacy up to that particular standard. And I think you made it very clear in your lecture that this should not be the case. Just each language has its own unique characteristics and other elements to it. I think a very known scholar, probably you're more aware of her than I am, Angela Duckworth. She put a very interesting book about, authored a very interesting book about grit. I think the question is probably, you may be able to elaborate more than I would. How literacy is related to grit? Because I think you made also a very interesting, in your last slide, literacy mediates all academic learning, and grit is just part of the academic learning. And I think grit, literacy, oracy, and all other fluency and accuracy in the language all go hand in hand. So if you can comment on the relationship between literacy and grit, I think it would be interesting. So thank you, sir.
Just a quick reaction to your previous comment. Yes, it is important to take each language in its own individuality, so to speak, but that is particularly important in early grades. By the time you get to PISA, for instance, it may be easier to compare, but when we're looking at early grades, it is extremely important to take into account the specificities of the language. In terms of grit, Angela Duckworth talks about how, well, academic grit, for instance, the ability to persevere in an academic project or in an academic pursuit. Learning can be very frustrating. When we don't understand something, we may want to give up. And that is one clear association between grit, which is perseverance, persistence, and learning. At the same time, if we are rewarded, or if we feel rewarded when we learn, that builds that motivation to learn. So there's a two-way relationship there that's not well understood, but we know that the two are related. We know that academic progress and social-emotional development are related. And developing grit is a way to make sure that children continue to learn when it's easy for them and when it's not easy.
And literacy is a very important component to that.
Yes.
Yeah. I have many more questions, but I think I'll leave them at the end. I think the audience may have some questions here. We'll take, how much time do we have? How many questions? 2, 3 questions? 5 questions. تفضلي أستاذة اللي رفعت ايدها هنا. تفضلي. Please, if there is a mic that can, so we should probably ask in Arabic.
I just want to comment about testing or assessing the students in their diglossia or their collegial language in Arabic. At what age is this going to happen if this is a proposal or an idea? For example, here in this region, students are learning 2 languages. Mostly in Emirate of Abu Dhabi are learning English almost as a first language. So having bilingual students causing some kind of confusion among the students, overwhelming them with not just the standard Arabic or the modern Arabic with their collegial language or diglossia is a kind of confusion. So keeping just the normal learning of the modern standard Arabic that is supported by English is a good way. The proposals that promote the collegial language and leave Arabic after the age of 9, for us as educators doesn't make sense. Because we cannot leave Arabic, standard Arabic, and assess them in their home language. Then we require students to pass some kind of national assessments in the standard Arabic.
I am really aware of the controversial nature of a proposal to teach colloquial Arabic in reading and writing, because of also the cultural, political, social, religious implications of such a proposal. I am aware of that, and I was quoting Arab scholars that were proposing that as one in a set of different options. The important thing is, are children learning to read in a language they understand? Is it a language that they understand? If it is a language they understand, it's not a problem. The situation in the Gulf countries is not going to be the same as in Morocco. I'm aware of that too. There's a lot more distance in Morocco between colloquial Arabic and modern standard Arabic than there is in this region, between the colloquial Arabic here and modern standard Arabic. So I am aware of all of those, and I'm not advocating for one specific solution. I'm just inviting you to think about, is this an issue in the region? And what would be some of the possible solutions of a battery of possible solutions? And one very important thing to take into account is learning languages. As you say, we don't want to confuse children, but learning languages is not a zero-sum game. It's not that we have a limited space in our brain that only allows for a certain number of languages. It is true that the process is a delicate process. I agree with that, and it may cause confusion, but the more languages we know, it's not just a useful knowledge to have. It changes the way our brain works.
Wires, yes.
Cognitive flexibility has been shown to increase when we are bilingual or multilingual. So yes, I agree with what you say, and we need to be very careful, but I think at the same time we need to ask ourselves the question, are we teaching children to read and write in a language they don't understand? Because if that is the case, that is an issue, and it's a bigger issue for some children than other children. So it has equity implications as well. But I agree with everything you said.
I think maybe just to comment on her question, teaching English as a first language for English-speaking people versus teaching English as a first language for non-English-speaking people. So that's probably her line of thinking. How strongly can you teach both languages at the same time? So thank you very much. Who's any other question, please? Somebody from this side here. Yes, please.
Basil Bedran. This is another comment, not a question. Just to be politically correct, I want to thank Mr. Cardoso for referring to the West Bank and Gaza as Palestine. Maybe Mr. Crawford can amend his slides and name West Bank and Gaza as Palestine. It is a recognized country by the UN, and their flag is in New York. Thank you.
Any other question, please? Gentleman, the second row, Ustad Adil.
Thank you a lot for the presentation, which is rich and nice enough.
One more question.
Okay. In PISA, we are at the stage of assessing reading to learn and not learning to read, which is mostly pearls. And you talked about the developing of the foundation of skills. And you talked about the diagnostic and moving from colloquialism to MSA, which is a very vital issue related to Prof. Nihad al-Musa in Jordan, who wrote a lot about this shift from colloquialism to MSA. Here in the Emirates, we are targeting now students at the age of 15 for the PISA, which is mainly those who were born in the 1st of January 2002 till the 31st of December. So the 80% of the sampling will be from grade 10. Now, I don't believe in one-size-fits-all for the all reading strategies. Out of your experience in this field, I would like you to suggest or direct us to an article or a website or a literature written on this, on the most beneficial reading skill that can be implemented, and we are waiting to get fruits in 5 months that can be conducted. This is something related from theory into practice.
Very difficult.
We are not working, we are not getting back to grade 7. We have only 5 months to deal with the whole majority of the sampling. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Adil. Please.
Well, I think I agree with Dr. Karima, who before was emphasizing how this is a long-run process. We need to be realistic about what can be done in 5 months or X number of months. I think these things are measured more in years than in months. What I would say is that I would emphasize critical thinking in the long run as one of the key issues to look at reading. And critical thinking doesn't mean being against things. It means being able to deconstruct an argument, to hear someone out, to really listen to what they're saying, and see whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. That is something that I would encourage as one approach that takes us further in terms of reading to learn, right? It may or may not be the approach that PISA takes. In some ways, I think it is. In some ways, it's not. One thing about PISA is that it has a very instrumental approach to reading. It's about extracting information from here and there. And I think, personally, that reading should be more than that. I think Pearls, for instance, looks at both informational texts and narrative texts, two types of texts. I mean, PISA also does, but it's only about 12%. Pearls is half and half. I think narrative texts are very important because we get to develop socio-emotional skills through reading as well, empathy. And we get to put ourselves in someone else's place and live through their experience. And also because it is easy to learn to enjoy reading by reading fiction than by reading only informational texts. So it may sound strange, but what I would suggest, if you want to improve in PISA in the long run, what I would suggest is don't do just what PISA tests. Get students to actually enjoy reading and to be critical about what they read, to make those skills sustainable and help those children not just to do well in PISA, but to do well in life. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you very much, both Dr. Michael Crawford and Dr. Manuel Cardosa. And I think our satiation for learning and education will never be fulfilled in 1 or 2 sessions. We'll leave the rest of the questions for later, and we thank the audience. I think for our next session, our mediator here will let us know when it will start. Thank you very much again, and please join me in thanking the